Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Americas in-Market update. I'm Ashley Ridley from State Promotions, Department for Trade and Investment, and I'm your host for this morning's webinar. Those of you who have previously joined our sessions, you will already be relatively familiar with our format. Firstly, we will hear from South Australia's Expert Overseas Representative, Regina Johnson, for the general update. And as this webinar series is focused on food and beverage, we'll then be joined by Wine Australia's Regional General Manager of Americas, Aaron Ridgway, although I've been told he's not related to our Minister for Trade and Investment, David Ridgway. So before we get started, I'd just like to cover just a couple of items. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the department's website, so you can go back at any time and review points of discussion items. At any time during the webinar, you can ask questions through the Q&A section on the right-hand side of your screen. So please ensure your question is directed to all panelists rather than to one specific person to ensure our moderator is able to see the questions. If we do run out of time, we'll include any unanswered questions and the answers onto our website. And of course, we've had the capacity as well to follow up any queries or provide further information to you personally. Just let us know. And lastly, we will have a 10-second poll pop up at the end of the webinar. So please do take the time to complete this for us to continually improve our communications. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Regina Johnson, South Australia's Deputy Director for the Americas region based in Houston. Welcome, Regina.
Hello, Ashley. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. And I would also like to thank Aaron for joining us to give the market overview for the U.S. wine industry.
Pleasure, Regina. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. So I will be covering three topics in my market overview. The first will be current conditions, the federal government actions, and then following up with opening up America Again guidelines. So we're about 4 to 6 weeks into various shelter-in-place directives around the U.S. Since our last webinar, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention has issued voluntary guidelines for wearing face coverings when in public. Some states, such as New York and Connecticut, have made face covering wearing mandatory in some cases when in public. Social distancing protocols are still the norm. However, the country is starting to plan on how to ease restrictions when be appropriate for each state. Next slide. The U.S. has just over 815,000 confirmed cases and over 44,000 deaths. And as I'm talking now, the number is still rising. As you can see from the map, there are various hotspots in the U.S. with a high concentration of cases in the northeastern states. Action is being taken at the federal, state, and local government levels to slow the spread of the virus. The CDC issued the voluntary guidance for wearing the face coverings if social distances cannot be maintained. 7 states have implemented mandatory requirements. For example, in Maryland, employees and any customer over the age of 9 years old must wear face masks when inside an essential business. Some cities have extended their shelter-in-place response as the cases of the coronavirus are increasing in their area. Over the weekend, the U.S. and Canada agreed to continue the limit of non-essential boarding crossings for another 30 days. In addition, Canada is requiring anyone flying into the country to self-quarantine for 14 days. Next slide. Over the last 4 weeks, just over 22 million people have lost their jobs in the U.S. This chart shows how the current unemployment rate compares to the past economic downturns. The number of unemployed is almost equivalent to the population of Australia. These unemployment numbers reflect the major layoffs that have occurred in the retail, restaurant, and hotel sectors. You have undoubtedly seen the news reports about the historical drop in oil prices to below zero. The oil and gas industry was not included in the U.S. $2.2 trillion stimulus package. The industry is taking a double hit with the dropping of oil prices and the drop in consumer demands due to the shelter-in-place directives. The oil and gas industry has announced additional layoffs and the possibility that some companies will go into bankruptcy. Next slide. In response to the current economic crisis, the federal government passed the $2.2 trillion stimulus package at the end of March. $350 billion was allocated for small business. The aim of the Payroll Protection Program was to help small businesses meet payroll. The loans would be forgiven if they kept their employees to the end of the crisis. However, the money is already run out. So Congress was initially working on an additional stimulus bill of $450 billion to replenish this fund and to give more aid to the healthcare industry and to fund coronavirus testing. However, since my slides were put together, the Senate has announced that it has passed a $484 billion stimulus package. So that bill will be working through the House and hopefully it'll be at the president's desk by the end of the week. But I know that they're working very hard to get that money out as soon as possible. Under the authority to protect American jobs, President Trump tweeted on Tuesday that he would sign an executive order to temporarily suspend immigration for those who wanted to live and work in the U.S. This idea was not well received by industry, so the president has modified his executive order to pause the issuance of green cards or those seeking permanent residency for 60 days. Migrant workers, high-tech workers, and other special visas are still allowed. As a result in unemployment and the state of the economy, state and local officials are under pressure from President Trump and local citizens to reopen for business. Anti-lockdown rallies have been held in Texas, Wisconsin, Ohio, California, and Minnesota. Next slide. On April 30th, the U.S. social distancing guidelines will expire. Though President Trump is anxious to reopen the country for business by the 1st of May, he recognizes the right of the state and local officials to make their own decisions. But to facilitate the opening of the country, President Trump has outlined the Opening Up America guidelines for state governors to gradually ease their lockdowns. However, within each state, county, and city officials will decide the time frame that they are ready to open up in their regions. There are 3 phases to the plan. If there are no relapses in the coronavirus after 14 days, then the states are advised to move to the next phase. At the core of the guidelines are social distancing protocols, protecting the most vulnerable citizens, and sanitation procedures. A few highlights from each phase are as follows. In phase 1, restaurants, movies, theaters, sporting venues, places of worship, and gyms can reopen if they observe strict social distancing protocols. Outpatient elective surgery can resume. However, bars are to remain closed. Employees should continue to work remotely, but the employers can start returning workers in phases. At phase 2, this allows for non-essential travel to resume. People can go to the malls, recreation centers. Social gatherings of 50 or less people is permitted with social distancing protocols. Schools and organized youth activities can resume. Bars are permitted at this stage to operate with diminished standing room occupancy where applicable and appropriate. In phase 3, states which have seen a downward trend of symptoms and cases can allow public interaction with physical distancing and the unrestricted staffing of work sites. Visits to care homes and hospitals can resume, and bars can increase their standing room only or standing room capacity. Some states could return to normal after a month-long implementation period. at the earliest, according to this document. Next slide. State and local officials are trying to balance public health with the pressures to reopen the government. Most are not making any changes prior to their own individual stay-at-home directives. States are concerned about having adequate equipment for testing for the coronavirus. As we saw on the map at the beginning of the presentations, states are at varying points on the coronavirus curve. So the Open for Business initiative will not happen simultaneously. It would be a staggered approach. There are some state governors who are ready to commit to the implementation of some form of the president's recommendations. In Texas, the stay-at-home directive expires on the 30th of April. However, Texas Governor George Abbott announced that state parks are to be open as of the 20th of April. In addition, retail can resume on the 24th of April, but on a to-go service. Over the weekend, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis opened up some of the state's beaches and parks. Other states are forming regional task force of business leaders and health professionals to coordinate as a region in the relaxation of restrictions. There's a West Coast task force that is comprised of California, Oregon, and Washington, East Coast task force of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Rhode Island. At the local level, governments are forming task forces as well to be advised easing of restrictions. Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner announced that Marvin Odom, the former president of Shell Oil, will lead recovery efforts for the city of Houston. The key focus areas for the Houston-Harris County Task Force will be to determine how testing and contact tracing for COVID-19 can be used in a back-to-work plan. Also, they will try to identify problems that may arise and make the necessary adjustment. And they will work with federal government to make sure that federal spending and local spending is done wisely. And they will also develop a plan to address future viral attacks on the city. Next slide. Over the next 30 days, we hope to have a better idea of how the recovery and opening of the country for business is shaping up. In the meantime, this is still a good time to make plans for exporting. Contact your local trade start advisor to discuss the international markets. We can provide market research. In addition, we can help identify potential clients in the market and reach out to those contacts on your behalf. So I'll be back after Aaron's presentation for the Q&A session. So back to you, Ashley. Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. That's a great insight into what's happening in the American region. It's really frightening to see the number of cases in America, and we're really feeling for you and your citizens. So we just hope things improve over this next sentence of time. So now, actually, as you mentioned, we will have a Q&A session after Aaron's presentation. So we might move on straight through to Aaron. So it gives me pleasure to introduce Aaron Ridgway, one of Australia's Regional General Manager of Americas, to share some insight into the wine market. Welcome, Aaron.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for having me. And I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds for my short presentation to come up on the screen. We might just pop right to the next slide, if we may. Just a warning, my contribution will not be a talk fest. We've got quite a lot of information on the slides. We can just pop to the next one. But yes, as Regina touched on in her excellent presentation, thank you, Regina, we are in very much a set of unprecedented circumstances economically, and one could argue that the food and beverage sector, certainly the hospitality sector, is the most dramatically affected. I think Regina's point about the total number of unemployed equaling the entire population of Australia is a very salient one. But of course, as we know, the restaurant industry is a significant place of employment for undocumented workers and other workers that can't apply for unemployment or would not be measured in that data. So it's a staggering economic impact. Sorry, if we can just go back to slide 2, just back one more if we can. There's a little bit of a delay. Thank you. Yes, definitely tricky times, but I wanted to start by just mapping out the sheer size of the US wine market to generate a little bit of a baseline for, what you might see as the economic impacts in the next weeks and months, but also just kind of place the United States in the world in terms of, how significant a wine market it is, and how significant for us as Aussies. So you can see there, population is significant, and which unfortunately makes it a great incubator for COVID-19. Look, the US has really seen consistent growth in per capita consumption since the mid-1980s. Significantly, there was a big spike in consumption in the early 1990s following a 60 Minutes report that made it clear that wine consumption could be attributed to a lower risk of heart disease. And then, of course, from the mid-90s through to the late 2000s, Australian wine in particular saw an absolutely enormous boom. The Yellowtail brand, launched in 2000, became the #1 wine brand in all of the USA. But certainly we reached 950 million Australian dollars in calendar year 2017, and it became far and away our largest export market. Times have changed. We're sitting at about 425 million Aussie dollars at the moment in terms of total exports to the US, but we're seeing a much more favorable mix. About 4 years ago, we were 95% wine that sold under $10 a bottle and 5% above, and we're now about 91% below and about 9% above. So definitely there's a premiumization trend more generally that I'll allude to a little bit later in the presentation that is benefiting Australian wine at the moment. You can see there are 104 million 9-litre cases total imports. Australia represents a decent share of that, just over 17%. Aussie wine has significantly under-indexed in premium price points over the last decade or so, and as I mentioned, that is starting to improve, which is good. If we can hop to the next slide, please. This is just a little bit of a summary of some of the trends that are governing, the changes in the wine market in the US. Just wait for that to come up on screen. Thank you. And this was formulated really without coronavirus as a consideration. This is just literally the kind of top line, trends and notable areas of growth that are underpinning the stability of the market. So rosé over the last 5 years has transitioned from an occasion beverage, a summer beverage, and is now consumed year-round. Wines that are a little bit lower in alcohol and a bit easier to pair with food. Impossible to stop the popularity of Cabernet Sauvignon. I live in Napa Valley, and I've only got to drive 5 minutes from my house and see that great variety isn't going away anytime soon as a governing force. Cider, this is an interesting one. We've had RTDs, ready to drinks, Jim Beam and Coke, Bundy and Coke, as long as there has been, alcohol sold in Liquorland. But recently, there's been much more adoption of those products at the consumer level and expansion of a consumer offering. So what we call hard seltzer is basically a vodka, lime and soda, or a gin and tonic that's pre-mixed in a can. That segment is growing anywhere between 15 and 20% and has literally added, over 100 million 9-litre cases in the last 18 months, just in the US alone. And those products are doing very well in Canada as well, and are growing at a pretty astronomical rate. Between 15 and 20% is levels of gain that beer, wine, spirits would be jealous of. Spirits are growing at about 5%. Wine is growing, kind of 2 to 3. Beer is essentially flat, and the craft beer boom, which saw an enormous influx of new, smaller production brands at the expense of, some of the market share of the larger beer brands, has kind of rendered the category pretty much flat. Healthy wines, no taste additives, gluten-free. I personally think wine is healthy, but apparently there are other ways to talk about wine being friendly. Alternative packaging, that's cans, that's casks. I feel like Australia has a pretty good understanding of casks, and we'll see if cans become a domestic thing. Oregon Pinot Noir, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc are some of the stylistic or the appellation-driven wines that remain strong. Consolidation and fragmentation, those are interesting. So larger wholesalers continue to gobble up large wholesalers. The top 10 now accounts for over 75% of all beverage alcohol sale, and the top 4 are probably between 55 and 60%. So it's very much become a top-heavy market. And fragmentation, believe it or not, even though the power has been concentrated in fewer and fewer companies, you can see 184,000 individual products introduced in the year 2019. So just a massive offering constantly. The marketplace is intensely competitive and in some ways moves very slowly, and then in some ways has become a place where just an absolutely cacophonous level of consumer choice and competition is there. And let's not forget about cannabis. It's approaching $10 billion in revenue that we know of. Since legalization, and THC blew up as a consumer segment. So there's still no data that specifies that legalization of cannabis directly impacts wine. But we are watching that carefully. Next slide, please. So just a little bit more information on the total market. You can see there, Australia's 17.9 million cases is 4.4% of the whole market. I just want to draw attention to the information at the bottom there. Since 2014, our offering that sells, above $10 a litre in Aussie dollars FOB, which really equates to a $10 bottle or over. We've managed to increase volume by 60% and value in 47%, and 10% and 8% respectively on average each year. So the challenge we inherited 5 years ago as Wine Australia was to absolutely stabilize volumes and just try to stop the bleeding, because we had transitioned from $950 million to under 400 million in a very short space of time, about 36 months. And then, with the help of the export and regional wine support package and, the stabilization of a local team and really the commitment to a new strategy, which was focused on premiumization, we were able to, engineer some more structural changes. So now, as mentioned, moving that category mix from 95% and 5% to, approaching 90% and 10%, there's just a different story developing in the market around Australian wine. We've managed to shed some of the assumptions around cheap and cheerful, the assumptions around critter brands, the assumptions around Australia being a great place to get something of value, or a big jammy red, maybe with a high score from a critic, and there being that missing level of complexity, which is what we really drink every single day domestically in Australia. It's your $15 to $25, Chardonnay and Pinot from High Country Victoria. It's, Grenache from McLaren Vale. It's a wonderful offering of Shiraz from different areas of the Barossa. Chardonnay from Margaret River, sparkling from Tassie. We've managed to promote and internalize, some of those great middle tier, everyday Aussie wines and wine styles and wine regions that really the US wasn't looking to talk about. When the category was sizzling hot, perceptions were very limited, and the trade really only wanted to engage with a very specific set of stereotypes and products and styles. So now, perception change is never done. There's always ways that you can reach more people and talk about yourself in more compelling ways. We've got a lot of competition out there. About 70% of all wine consumed in the United States is domestic, which is pretty significant when you think that 104 million cases are coming from outside the country. So they love them some US wine, and why not? There's wine made in every state in the US. But we really feel, and prior to COVID, and I'll talk a little bit about its impacts in a moment, but really prior to COVID, I think we were we were making sense of a challenging market, and our data was starting to show that the market was ready to absorb more of our premium offering. Now, COVID has stood down the restaurant industry in the US almost in its entirety. About 17% of all wine volume and about 30% of all wine value moved through the on-premise chain prior to COVID. And unfortunately, a lot of the perception work that we do happens in restaurants. You know, that the by the glass, the chance for a customer to sit and spend a bit more time, you know, engaging with a bottle, turning it around, reading the label, maybe reading some tasting notes, even just sipping it a few times with nothing to do in an airport or at a hotel bar and just enjoying it. You know, those circumstances align to make it a very, very favorable place to put exciting wines from Australia and have people engage with them. So we did a Vino Volo promotion at the end of last year where we sold almost 50,000 glasses of Australian wine across 47 airports in the US and Canada. And that was, you know, just extraordinary brand exposure. And those numbers came through that showed that, you know, Vino Volo did really great business out of that partnership as well. So, you know, the market, it does not need to be convinced if Australian wine is placed in the right on-premise channel. Sadly, all of those channels have closed for the foreseeable future. And one of the things I think Regina's presentation conveyed really well is just the sheer sophistication of a country made up of 50 states and there being varying opinions and different strategies to, you know, reopening economies. And right now, the hospitality industry is something of an amputee from any economic activity that's possible at the moment, and that's really unfortunate. If we just hop to the next slide, it isn't all doom and gloom, although we are absolutely desperate for the on-trade to find a way to come back to functioning and to get back to, you know, any semblance of business as usual, although it's almost inconceivable that it'll be business as usual anytime soon. Direct-to-consumer sees considerable opportunity, and high-volume e-commerce, think national or regional retail with delivery and e-commerce capability, is absolutely booming. You can see here, you know, 32% up year on year. $11 to $25 is growing faster than 8 to 11. 246% increase on e-commerce alcohol sales against the same week of 2019. Wine.com, which is the national leader, you can see up over 100%, and their membership program is up almost 600%. So they're not just taking panicked customers that want to stock up once. They have a whole new tsunami of customers that want to know more about what Wine.com does, become members, and make repeat purchases. Wine.com, just for reference, is our key activation partner in the e-commerce space. We invest with them and do category promotions that talk regionally and stylistically and focus on key varieties. Those programs work really well. They're not cheap, but they lead to sales growth of, you know, anywhere between 20 and 30% in value, which is fabulous for a customer of that size. They did $150 million US in total revenue in 2019. And just for context, they shipped $1 million in one business day 2 weeks ago in the early part of April. So if you have the capability and the customers, e-commerce is a great way to grow your business, even despite the asphyxiating effects of coronavirus. That said, companies like Drizzly is essentially a 4-tier provider. We call those companies 4-tier. Now, those are delivery operations that don't have alcohol licenses, but they are able to collect a shipment from a licensed retailer and take it to a paying customer. And their delivery margin almost amounts to another layer. So that's why we call them 4 tiers. So you've got importing, wholesaling, retailing, and then companies like Drizzly and Tipsy and Uber Eats. There are a number of those businesses now that really take those products from licensed retailers and take them as finished commercialized purchases and deliver them to customers. So a little bit more detail on the on-premise on that right column there, that that sort of says estimates that 20% of bars and restaurants won't reopen. Since we built this presentation, that estimate has climbed closer to 1/3, and it could be as much as 50% because of those, those lasting impacts of restaurants. So were really the hardest hit. They were hit earliest and hardest, and it takes a lot of investment and a lot of cash to open a restaurant. So if restaurants have closed and lost all of their cash flow, most restaurants only have about 30 to 45 days of operating expenses in the bank in cash. So getting that capital and getting the confidence, and even, I guess this is slightly subjective, maybe I should telegraph that it's my own opinion, but I think social distancing will play a role in this as well. Whether restaurants choose to open up with seating or a license to open up with seating that's 6 feet apart, or what does that mean for dive bars? What does that mean for concert venues? What does that mean for golf clubs and places where large numbers of human beings just kind of congregate freely? If the American Medical Association and the Centers for Disease Control and these other bodies that are tasked with making sense of, to Regina's points, how the economy reopens, we might see an entire food and beverage nation that has different revenue potential based on restrictions and the need for public health. Pop to the next slide, please, and I will just do a quick summary of the key elements that we're focused on as Wine Australia, just after this next slide, which very much just summarizes what I've gone through here. So overall, the industry is healthy and has grown consistently for 2.5 decades, with the first very, very slight dip in consumption at the end of last year for wine specifically, that we believe can be attributed to the growth of, as I said, hard seltzers and the consistent, sort of 5 to 7% year-on-year growth in spirits. Baby boomers getting older. Millennials are a little bit more agnostic about what they drink. There's a no consumption, or a sober curious, as we call it, movement among millennials, where actually 30% of millennials are considering taking extended periods of not drinking, and a subset of those people are moving to not drinking at all. I talked about Australian wine in the USA, talked about COVID-19. So there's a snapshot of your winners and losers. Just my final slide, if we could move to that, please. And I apologize, there are a couple of typos. With this audience connecting on today's webinar, and thank you so much for your time. I didn't want to miss a chance to present to you guys a draft of Wine Australia's global strategy that we are going to be unveiling shortly, just to give you a little bit of an idea of where we're headed in the next 5 years. So we've come to the end of the 50 mil, the Export, Regional and Wine Support Package. And we're very excited to have reported on some fantastic outcomes from that package. But we are setting the business up to move forward without significant investment, and with a lower crush and, some pretty competitive environments abroad, and, the Australian dollar not being as competitive as it has been in the US. This is a global slide, but I just wanted to draw attention in particular to the elements that affect the US. So China, you can see there, we really focus on awareness. The USA, we're focusing on distribution. Now, only about 10% of Australian wineries are exporters to the US, which is very, very challenging and keeps me up at night, but does get me out of bed every day. We really want to grow that to 15 or 20%, and there are enormous barriers to entry for the US, the 3-tier system, that stranglehold that large wholesalers have, as I mentioned, and intense competition from Europe and domestic wine, as well as spirits, hard seltzers and cannabis. Really, we're just looking to build awareness, continued awareness in Canada, the EU and the UK. Our objectives: create positive sentiment here in the USA around premium Aussie wine. We just want to protect the growth that we've achieved in China and make sure that it continues. And we're always looking to align everything we do around category building activities with our exporters, and make sure that we are in lockstep with our sector, and ensure that we are maximizing the impact of our own dollars, and in turn, we're maximising the investment that all of our exporters and key stakeholders are making as well. Our strategic pillars: Australian wine made our way. That's our consumer brand. That's the nice black and white colouring, black, white and red colouring of this presentation. When you see our social channels, Instagram, LinkedIn, you see that wonderful branded content that RGA made, our agency, ahead of the 50 mil. That's made our way. Education, which is awareness development through Australian Wine Discovered, our education platform. Key influencers, those are just the big decision makers inside retailers, on-premise chains and wholesalers. And sustainability is becoming a strategic pillar. This is a work in progress, but we feel that there's a way that the Australian wine sector can speak more coherently about sustainability. And finally, our initiatives, and this is sadly where the typos are, just making sure that our media content is up to date and powerful, and enables us to do more with less as we are a bit more nimble going forward as an organisation, and unable to have an event program, the likes of which we have had in the past from impacts around coronavirus and others. Commercial promotional support, that is the way we invest into companies like wine.com. We do wholesaler promotions. We have our market entry program run by Damon Musha. And finally, just delivering education in a seamless, scalable, accessible way, which again is, if you go to AustralianWineDiscover.com, we have a free, open source and absolutely world-class set of educational resources. So just in closing, sorry, I just, I'm without daycare here, and that was just my son. So sorry, thank you very much for your time. I will participate in the Q&A as possible, but happy to answer any questions following the presentation as possible. And that, I believe, is the end of my 15 minutes. Sorry for the slight interruption of an unsupervised family member. And thank you very, very much for your time, everyone.
Oh, thanks, Aaron. That was great. And no dramas at all with children. We're all working through that here as well, with the majority of the people here in South Australia working from home. So that was absolutely fantastic. I love that. Wine is healthy, because I like to think it's healthy too. And I'm sure our wine importers and exporters all found that very useful. So some great tips there on what's happening in the Americas hospitality and wine industry. So we do have a couple of questions. Are there opportunities for South Australian companies to export the personal protection equipment to the USA, specifically masks? I think you've actually covered that maybe in a previous webinar, but if you'd just like to briefly open up your response there, that would be great.
Yes, there is opportunity to export. The export is made possible under the FDA emergency use authorization, and companies are permitted to, as long as the masks are up to the Australian standards, then they are permitted to be sold here in the US.
That's good. So if a company is interested, are they best contacting you or TradeStart in the first instance? What's the process, do you think?
In the first instance, they should contact TradeStart and go from there, and then they will bring me in at the appropriate time. I will post information on the website as just a follow-up to this question, so that you will have the information as far as being able to go to the FDA website and seeing the criteria and the information that you would need to have prepared.
That's great. So if there are any companies, if there are companies out there, you can also lodge your details in the Q&A section, and we can connect you with the right TradeStart advisor as well. So we can hook you up as well. If someone else has another product that's not listed on the EUA, what's the process involved?
Yes, the FDA does have a process that allows companies to submit their product for EUA consideration. And so there's a form that is filled out pre-export or pre-use in the US, where you have to, of course, describe the product, but then also describe what unmet need the product is going to be addressing. So again, there's an email address to submit that information. So again, you can start with the TradeStart representative, but I will post the information as well online for that process as well.
Oh, that's excellent. One for you, Aaron. With the COVID-19 impacts range widely in severity across the states and cities of the USA for current and prospective significant markets, what's the relative impact on the ongoing demand or potential for wine consumption in those different cities or states? I hope I've raised that correctly.
It's a very good question. Look, in large cities where alcohol is easily available, business is booming. I think the availability of product and the growth, the fact that we're seeing such enormous growth in brick and mortar retail, e-commerce, DTC wineries are doing a healthier business through their wine clubs. Look, I think consumption is pretty consistently up. I can't speak to specific data, but I will say that it's our understanding that consumption is significantly up across the entire United States. In recession type conditions, we always see an increase in alcohol consumption. I think between all of us, we can imagine why that is. But certainly everything from intentions to stockpile or, make sure that there's enough in the house before things may run out, to, alcohol playing a little bit more of a role in people's day-to-day, to the fact that, alcohol companies as well, large wineries and large wholesalers have very, very big budgets that they need to hit as well. So they're going to their retail partners and, making sure that they're getting the best pricing and getting as much inventory as they can possibly sell them, so that then again, business continues. So I think, definitely suppliers will, send their wines to markets where it's easiest to do business. And that's going to be New York, California, Texas, Florida, and Illinois. I would say that there's also the port activity to consider as well. In fact, I've just asked for an update from JF Hillebrand because they have they've flagged that some port activity in Adelaide and in Melbourne has been a bit slow, but largely, containers are leaving and being turned around reasonably quickly. But yeah, there's the benefit for wine producers as such is mostly felt by national brands, and brands that have a really good amount of inventory already on US soil. But, I will say this: if good wine is in stock and it's priced well, consumers are grabbing it. It's a pretty crazy time.
Oh, that's good. And there was a follow-up question to that as well. Where are the greatest prospects for market development, or alternatively market support and reinforcement?
In terms of developing markets, it's those 5 major states that I mentioned. New York, Illinois, Florida, Texas, California. Those are the biggest wine markets in the country, and correspondingly the biggest markets for Australian wine. If you're not currently exporting, it is a very challenging time to have a meaningful conversation with an importer. Because the Australian dollar fell pretty significantly prior to this, we were really hoping for a favourable set of trading conditions, because when the Australian dollar is about 60%, that's really good margin for an exporter and really good margin for the United States importer. So I would say it's a tricky time to be, especially through social distancing, not being able to visit the US and place your brand. But if you are here, if you're already selling wine in the US, I would say it's really about supporting your importer, supporting your wholesale partners as much as you can. Make sure they've got the best pricing, make sure that you're having meaningful conversations around, putting together containers, try to focus on existing items, try to maximize the velocity of products that you've already got that are already in the wholesaler network. If you can get those things working with good pricing and, good POS, if there are digital sell sheets or information you can give to your wholesalers when your wines are getting ratings, or if you've got some exciting story material, whether it's coming out of Vintage 20 or might have got a great write-up in an Australian magazine. Those are all things that retailers are desperately looking for. They want the latest content about the wines on their websites for their email offerings, and distributors need a reason to talk to retailers as well. So updated brand information can be very, very valuable.
Some really good advice there, Aaron. Thank you. Now, Ben Howard's actually raised a question I think everyone online is really keen to hear. Your views on election timing and the stability of President Trump's role. What's your take on it? We might start off with you, Aaron. What's your take on that question?
Confirming that you can hear me, Ashley?
Yes, confirming we can. Thank you.
Well, very good question. And I've got to be super careful here because I don't know if I'm talking to Republicans or Democrats. Look,
perhaps it's a general view, like in a general view, maybe not a personal view, but a general feel.
Oh, absolutely. If you're looking for a personal view, I would be more inclined to ask my 3-year-old than give you my own. But look, the timing is pretty extraordinary. I think the dynamic is very interesting because the presumptive Democratic nominee is not a social media typhoon as the incumbent Republican leader is. So the next 6 months are going to be really interesting in that space, whether the Democratic Party can make its voice louder on social media. I think the louder the Democratic voice gets, the more interesting the presidential race will become, because we know we've already got somebody on the Republican side who is very, very strong in that space. It probably boils down to how the economy restarts, and I think a debate that I hear a lot about is, what is the cost of reopening the economy? Should it be mentioned? Should it be measured in unemployment, or more measured in, the potential loss of life and the health impacts? I think that as we get closer to November, there is a pretty unprecedented chance for American society to come together around a path forward. We've lived through a fairly divisive and quite partisan political time over the last couple of years. So if the prevailing narrative becomes, Americans working together to really remake the country and the economy, either party could approach that in a really powerful way. But I think, if the unemployment figures continue as they are, and the cases are stabilized and economies begin to reopen in a responsible way, really that narrative around, Americans working for all Americans is what should and could potentially define November. And it's up to, looks like, a couple of septuagenarian American males to squabble with one another about how they're going to do that. It was going to be a fascinating November before all of this, so only time will tell. Regina, are you with us now?
Yes, Regina, we can't hear you. Just try your switching your mic on. We'll give that a try. I think, just try it again. No, we'll finish up there. Look, that's all for the question time at the moment. Thanks so much, Aaron. It was really great to hear your views there and to share what you feel is the general sense of the election process and President Trump's role. As everyone can see, there's a lot of support both from government and associations. We're here to help. Connect with us, and we can connect you with Wine Australia, Business SA, Food SA, and the Chambers, etc. Thanks, Regina and Aaron. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us. I'm sure everyone online that's taken the time out of their day to view has gained some insight, valuable insight. So we're just going to pop a short poll up on screen now. If you can fill this out, this helps us to improve our webinars into the future. There's also a field there that if you'd like to suggest themes or sector-specific presentations, let us know. We can work through future webinars to incorporate that information. And of course, lastly, if you can join us tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. for our latest Hong Kong update, we'll have Alice Jim, our offshore rep in Hong Kong, join us to present together with a presentation from Austrade and the director from Wilson International Frozen Foods, who will share his insights on prospective opportunities for SA companies in the Hong Kong market. So that should be really interesting. So please, if you're able to join us, fill out the poll, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks everyone, and have a lovely day.